Okay, well, let me jump in here. I want to talk about wrong view. We often talk about right view and the idea of as part of the Eightfold Path, but I think looking at what wrong view is really helpful. It's always helpful to look at what gets in the way of something. If you're trying to move towards right view, what gets in the way? Wrong view. And a couple of weeks ago, I uh, had the opportunity to spend some time with a Buddhist monk, a Buddhist nun, a bhikkhuni, Vimala, who I brought to, who stayed with me for a few days, and then I brought them out to Mahapajapati near Pioneer Town, and we were talking, and they were telling me about this one sutta, the Vipallasa Sutta, which I had taught a couple of years ago. And Vimala said that Bhikkhu Bodhi, when he talks about this sutta, he talks about it as a teaching on wrong view, even though that's not mentioned in the sutta. And I said, oh, and so I looked back into it, and I thought it would be really helpful to talk about it, especially in with what's going on in our world today. It's wrong view is what causes so much harm, and I'll get more into that later. It's a short sutta, and it's often translated as the distortions of the mind, or it's a lot of times it's translated as perversions of the mind, but Andrew Lenski translates it as distortion, which I find I like that too, where the places that the mind is distortion of perception. And they also say, Bhikkhu Bodhi calls it inversions of perception, and it's also called fabrications of perception, but I'll say distortions. And these three distortions, there's three types. There's distortions of perception, of the mind, and distortion of view, and I'll talk about those. And the distortions are seeing permanent things as, or seeing impermanent things as permanent, experiencing suffering as pleasurable, assuming there's a self when there is no self, and sensing the unlovely as the lovely. And basically what it is, it's taking the three characteristics of existence and just kind of turning them upside down. The three characteristics that are that everything's impermanent, that there is no fixed self, and that life is unsatisfactory. There is discomfort, dukkha exists. And so the denial of all of that is wrong view, is a misperception. And it's important to recognize, as I said, because these distortions are so prevalent in our lives and in our thoughts and in worldview. Basically it's a sutta about ignorance and not seeing the world clearly, wrong view. And we all have perspectives on things, and it's how we move through the world. And a lot of times we're trapped by false interpretations of what we experience. And most our original experience, or the first experience we have, is through our senses. It's the traditional five senses of smell, sight, sound, taste, touch. And in Buddhism, thought is also considered a sense. And what happens is we have some sense perception, and we immediately interpret it. There's a sound, and it's like, what is that? Is that a fire engine? Is a song that I know? You smell something, you try and place that. Thought comes into the mind immediately, it's almost like labeling things immediately. And sometimes we're correct, and sometimes we're incorrect. A lot of times we make assumptions that aren't right. And so that's the initial place where we experience these moments of perception. And it's not that we are flawed or that we're wrong, but it's that the mind is not perceiving things clearly. Like with distortion of perception, it's mistaking those things that come through the senses. And The classic story is the five men and the elephant. I don't remember if they were blind or blindfolded, but they were each taken to a particular part of the elephant. One felt the trunk, one felt the tail, one felt a leg, one felt an ear, one felt the body. And then they all came back and described five different animals. And they were angry. And it's like, no, it's this, it's that. And they all had a different perception because that's what they experienced through their sense of touch. It's, we hear things the wrong way. I think about this, it's like song lyrics. How many times have you heard a song lyric and sang along with it, and then you read the lyrics and go, it's absolutely nothing that I thought it was. I I taught this class, gave this talk last night, and I mentioned I had an experience. I saw Stevie Nicks a couple of years ago, and one of her biggest hits, I guess Fleetwood Mac's biggest hits, I thought the title was Green Amber, and for like 40 years I'm singing Green Amber, and it turns out when I saw her, they had the title on a screen behind her. It's Rhiannon, and I'm like, oh, I had no idea. And apparently that's everybody knows that except me. I'm like, Green Amber. That's a misperception, but that's a simple one. That's a silly one. But how many of those are we take much more seriously? This creative listening. But the news about it is that usually if we do a little bit of investigation, or if we pay a little bit more attention, we can clarify the mistake. Like if we see something in the shadows and turn on the light, we'll go like, oh, okay, it's a sock, not a rat. Or anyway, so there's distortion of perception, misperceiving the sensory input that we have. It happens all the time. Distortion of thought is taking it a little bit further when we experience that misperception of that, the distortion of perception, and then allow it to become a story. We hear something like some of the branches or the wind at the windows in the evening, and it all of a sudden is somebody trying to get in, or rats gnawing in your attic or something, or somebody says something or doesn't say something, or you see a text, or somebody walks by you on the street, and immediately these thoughts come up. And that's when we start getting into rumination, and we begin to create stories. And papancha, this beautiful word that I love, papancha, means proliferation of thought. One thought leads to the next thought, leads to the next thought. You're out of a job and you'll never work again. You don't get called back for an interview. I'll never work again. And a lot of this first seed is planted in that distortion of perception, but we haven't noticed it, and it got through, and then we create the story of it. Or it's based on our biases that we have, how we see ourselves, how we view the world, and they become these things. And these things can be really painful. These things can be really, really, really painful. The things we believe about others, the things we believe about ourselves. And the next one is really important, because this is I think where so much damage comes from, so much harm is caused. It's the distortion of view. When these patterns of thought, these thoughts that come out of the distortion of thought become solidified and rigid. It's prejudices, it's conspiracy theories, and one thing builds into something else, and that becomes your view. It becomes a fact, so to speak. This is the way it is. Not it's a misperception, but we actually have that. No, I know this is true. And we do it about ourselves. We're unlovable, we're this, we're that. We do it with other people. Oh, we other people. And we are so far away from reality when we're caught up in these views without paying attention to them. And simple story, I was, years ago, I took a friend of mine to yoga who had always wanted to do yoga. And So we were in class and the teacher was inviting us to do a particular pose. I don't even remember what it was. And my friend was going, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this. And if you look at her, she was actually doing it. But her mind said, I cannot do this, and totally ignored the reality that she was doing it. I mean, sometimes it's that extraordinary. Oftentimes it's extraordinary that we just kind of ignore reality because we're so attached to our views and our ideas of should and it needs to be this way. We become attached, and attachment is kind of a place that dukkha comes from. That's a root of our suffering, is attachment and clinging and craving and wanting it to be the way we want it to be. Andrew Olensky, who's done a lot of translations, he said, when talking about these three levels of distortion, he says they're cyclical too. And he says our perceptions are formed in the context of our views. So we have these views, and then we hear something, we see something, we read something, and then we create the perception kind of aligns to our views, which are then strengthened by our thoughts. And so all three work together to build what he says, to build the cognitive systems which make up our personality. So we're just a conglomeration of all these views and perceptions, some of which are valid and some of which are really nowhere near reality. And we have these bubbles that are driven by causes and conditions, and these ideas and these habits of mind that we've grown up with and that are really entrenched. And Larry Ward, who I love, he's a Vietnamese Zen teacher, student at Thich Nhat Hanh. In his book America's Racial Karma, he has this quote, and he says, studies by neurobiologists and psychologists researching habit formation indicate that 40 to 90% of human behavior, how we think, how we respond with emotions, what we say, and how we act, falls into the habit category. So when it comes to deeply rooted thoughts and behaviors, however good we think our intentions may be, without insight about the need to change, the strong resolve to make it happen, and the corresponding action, a good 50% of the time we will default to a habit. So we may recognize it, but we have to bring effort. We have to bring resolve, of willingness. These are all parts of the Eightfold Path. So it's not just thinking about it. We have to really make the effort to break these habits. Otherwise, half of the time we don't have any agency over what we do or say or how we behave. How often have you said, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Where'd that come from? So these habits are reinforced by our perceptions, our thoughts, and our views, and we just have this bias. And when the mind is distorted, when we're lost in wrong view, we've lost our connection to the senses, and we're operating solely from reactivity. Solely from reactivity. There's a quote from the book Deep Diversity, and it talks about how these emotions and these biases exist at an overt and a covert level. And when they're unconscious, when we don't have full awareness, they influence our behavior, our thoughts, and our choices. So all this stuff that's below the surface has us acting in ways that may not be really good for us or others. And these implicit biases run our lives until we make the choice to stop and investigate. And usually what happens is it's uncomfortable, or we cause harm, or our guts are churning. It's like, what is going on here? Or yeah, there's a lot of times it's unpleasant, and that's why we stop and say, what is going on? Why is this happening? It's true in so many areas of our life. It's true in our families. It's true in our work life. It's true in our relationships with friends and partners. And most of these views that we have can be harmless, but a lot of them are not. A lot of them are not. Somebody does something to us once and then we label them a particular way, and you're never going to change my mind about that. And we just get into this place of, no, really, really, really rigid. And if you find yourself being really, really, really rigid, that should be a clue to begin to say, maybe, because rigidity is never really good. Rigidity is when you break. I learned years ago that they never had buildings in downtown Los Angeles over so many floors because they didn't have the technology to withstand the seismic impact of an earthquake. And now they have this technology. And if I'm wrong on this, you can correct me, but this is what I think I heard. Now if you're ever on a higher floor of a building, it sways. There's give to it. It's not rigid. It's when it's rigid, it breaks. And so when we're rigid in our views, when we have these fixed views, that's when it gets painful. And in fact, one of the aspects of stream entry, this movement towards awakening enlightenment in these teachings, is letting go of fixed views. These fixed views fall away. So in order to get to enlightenment, we have to be willing to let go of these fixed views. So that's all, to a certain extent, I've been talking about it on a personal level, but it's also on a societal level. Societies and cultures have views that are rigid and kind of permeate the culture, and we see that now. And I especially want to lift that up because of the escalation in hate crimes that we're seeing, both in the United States and around the world. But, just this week we had the killing in Jacksonville, Florida, by a person who shot 3 Black people because he said, "I hate Black people." That is this rigidity of a view of this person is worthy of my hatred for whatever reason. And so there's anti-gay and anti-trans and anti-climate change and anti-immigrant and anti-education. There's all kinds of stuff. There's all these views that get rigid. And all these people didn't just sit around and come up with this stuff on their own. They've been in place for a long time and now being fostered by people for whom it's their benefit. The idea the Mexicans are rapists and Mexicans are drug dealers is a distortion of the mind. And the word perversion actually works here. That was foisted upon people who then believe it, who then take it in without questioning. This is a person I like. This is a person I trust. This is what they say. Oh, I'm going to believe that. And this stuff has been going on for decades and centuries. And so it's the water in which we swim. You see it every day. We see it everywhere. It's pervasive. And Ruth King, who's a wonderful teacher, talks about this in her book, Mindful of Race. And she talks specifically about race, but you can use it in regards to anything. So I want to read a couple of passages from her book, Mindful of Race. Really good. And she says, we have racially conditioned perceptions that operate on past experiences stored in the mind. And as I said, it's racially conditioned, but all other conditioned views. These include memories, views, beliefs, and fears, all of which stimulate the mind to act or behave in ways that make sense to us. Once we perceive race, the mind immediately scans the memory bank of past experiences to interpret what's being perceived. We then add layers of meaning and experience, and the experience shifts from bare perceiving into something more textured and nuanced. When layered, perceptions become distorted, sticky, and weighty. Essentially, we think we know something. We think we know something. And then we're often running all based on past experiences and preferences and belief. And usually, not always, but usually it's all in our minds, or at a minimum, worthy of questioning. No, oftentimes we're working on the past. We're streaming our past lives based on old experiences, old stories, old beliefs. And this is when the bubble thing comes in. We feel more reassured when our views are mirrored back to us. And we are on guard when our views are challenged. You see that all the time in social media. You see that all the time in the rhetoric that's so rampant in our political system. And views that don't align with ours are oftentimes overlooked as well or unnoticed. We stop being mindful when we think we know. When we think we know, and that's when the harm happens. Perception determines the characteristics of what it perceives. For example, whether a race is threatening or whether a race is worth paying attention to. It determines whether we like someone or something and whether we shoot someone and run. And it's necessary to understand this cycle of misperception. And understanding the cycle of misperception supports us in distinguishing these habits of harm, as Ruth says. We have to understand that we get trapped in these cycles. All of us do. Buddha talked about wrong view. It's pervasive. And mindfulness can help us recognize these cycles of misperception and use our perceptions as invitations to look deeper, to unknot that inner distress of harm, so that our reactions can be attended to more mindfully. We don't want to just move out of reactivity. We want to be able to move with agency, with recognition. This is where the idea of beginner's mind comes in. It's so important, to reckon. If you start going, oh, I know that, I know that, I know, that should be a like, hello, maybe you don't know mind is beginner's mind. Of course we know things, but to be so attached to a particular view, it's painful to let go of these views. Sometimes it's painful to begin to question things we've always believed. But this is where I think I always go back to this, the teachings, the Eightfold Path, this invitation to investigate, this invitation to sit. Mindfulness is the foundational piece of all of this. This willingness to investigate, this willingness to be still. When there's this discomfort in the body, when we see harm being caused, can we pause and say, what's going on? What is this? Is this an assumption? Is this a rigid view? What is it? And I'll tell a story which is quite simple, but it's so exemplary of, or exemplifies this thing. And I've told it many times. When I used to teach at this meditation center, it was an old building with an old air conditioner, and the air conditioner was loud, and every time it would turn on, right before it would turn on, you'd hear this click click, and it would get really cold, and it would blow right where the teacher was sitting. And so and then I being in front of the room would get really cold, and I didn't like that. And so I remember this one time I was leading the meditation at the beginning of class, and it was like, it was probably like 100 degrees out, so we had to have the AC on. And so I was sitting there, and I heard this click click, and immediately my head went, ugh. I hate that air conditioner. I hate it. It's going to be awful. I'm going to get cold. I'm going to be miserable. Ugh, I hate this. Meanwhile, I'm leading you all into meditation. Come back to the present. Let it go. And so there's this story going on in my head while I'm offering these instructions. And then at some point I said, maybe I should try and practice the instructions I'm offering. And so I stopped that story, because that story was nowhere near the present. That story was this fixed view, this air conditioner equals this, because that's been true in the past, but so it's obviously true now. And I stopped and I went, actually, I'm fine. I'm not cold. It's fine. But until we are willing to pause and take that time to really say, what is this? What is this? Because I was all tied up in knots inside, and that is a good clue. Are you tied up in knots inside? Then can you pause and reflect and say, bring that beginner's mind. What is this? Oh, that's a really old story, but does it have any bearing on the reality of the moment? Oh, no. They're like two different planets, many Zoom boxes away from each other. Oh, what is the reality of this moment? That's what we have to do. That brings us back to being able to respond with wisdom, hopefully being able to respond with kindness, and it allows us to release when we're dealing with other people and with prejudices and this viewpoints that we've been taught but may not necessarily be true. It allows us to question this othering. Because when we have these fixed views, especially about other people, they don't take into consideration people as human beings. They're often just, we're viewing others as cardboard cutouts. And so to get rid of that cardboard cutout and just say, what is the reality of this moment? And recognize again with this Eightfold Path, this wise action, how do we interact with people? How do we not cause harm? How do we relate with kindness and compassion? How do we use wise speech? How do we cultivate compassion and generosity and kindness? So there's the whole shift if we're willing to let go and say, maybe I don't have the answers. Maybe this is wrong view, unskillful thinking, unwholesome thought, not beneficial. Then we can begin to disentangle from these habits of mind. And that's what leads to nibbana. That's what leads to freedom, this willingness to let go of the things we may have believed from when we were kids. Can we do that? So I invite you to recognize those places or find those places where there's some discomfort for you. Oftentimes we run up, and I facilitate a year to live. I've been doing it pretty much every year for many, many years. And that's what we run into. Oftentimes folks run into these rigid ideas of shoulds and coulds. And now you're faced with, the spiritual practice of the end of life. And it's like, is this really serving me? Does this have any meaning in my life, or is this luggage that I've been dragging along with me all these years? And the invitation is to let go of what doesn't serve. That's what renunciation is, letting go of what doesn't serve or what causes suffering. So I invite you, my friends, to be willing, as Larry Ward says, to find the insight about the need to change, the strong resolve to make it happen, and the corresponding action. So you can let go of those habits that may not serve you or others. So thank you, my friends, for your kind attention. And I'd love to hear if there's any questions or comments or thoughts or rebuttals. Well, you're all awesome. And I love you all, and I just am so tickled to sit with you on these days. I am going out of town for a couple of weeks, so I will not be teaching on a Sunday, but I will be doing that half day on September 30th and at my Zell Center. I look forward to any of you seeing you eyeball to eyeball at that time. Yeah, and then y'all know that there's classes and sits many times during the week, so you can just check out the website. And I think Mira put in the chat box how you can support the sangha financially. You can support the sangha with volunteering. That's always appreciated. We can always use help, especially now that we're getting back in person. These monthly things, we can always use some help with volunteers. Yeah, thanks, Mira. I appreciate that. And so let's just sit for a couple of minutes before we move. Remembering that these teachings are a way for us to move towards liberation, a way for us to move towards freedom, letting go of these challenges, these wrong views, these misperceptions that can cause so much suffering to ourselves and to others. And know that wherever you go in the world, you can search high or low, near or far, north, west, east, south. You will never find anyone more worthy of love and kindness and compassion than you. Thank you all, my friends, for being here. And I will see you next time. Much love.